The morning sun had barely crested the Cithaeron mountains when the Persian cavalry spotted them. A small contingent of Greek hoplites, no more than 2,500 men, isolated and vulnerable on the plain near Plataea. After days of cautious maneuvering, supply line harassment, and strategic repositioning, the Greeks had finally made a mistake. Or so it seemed to the Persian commanders watching from their encampment across the Asopus River. What followed would become one of the most decisive engagements in ancient warfare, a moment when a fraction of the Greek army, cut off from their allies and seemingly doomed, turned desperation into devastating victory. This was not the grand clash of 100,000 men that characterized the larger Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE. This was something more intimate, more desperate, and in many ways more revealing about the nature of ancient Greek warfare and the fatal weaknesses in the Persian military system. The last 2,500 Greeks, primarily Spartans and Tegeans, would face a force more than 20 times their size and emerge victorious, breaking the back of Persian power in Greece forever. The road to Plataea. To understand how such an improbable victory occurred, we must first understand the strategic situation that led to this moment. The year was 479 BCE, and Greece had survived what seemed like certain annihilation. The previous year, King Xerxes himself had led an enormous invasion force across the Hellespont, overwhelming Greek defenses at Thermopylae, burning Athens to the ground, and bringing the Persian Empire to the brink of total victory in the Aegean. But the naval battle at Salamis had changed everything. The Greek fleet, led by the Athenian Themistocles, had lured the Persian navy into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, where Greek seamanship and the heavy trireme design proved devastating against the more numerous but less maneuverable Persian ships. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the shore, witnessed the destruction of his naval supremacy. Fearing that the Greeks might sail to the Hellespont and destroy his pontoon bridges, trapping his army in Europe, he retreated to Asia with a substantial portion of his forces. Yet Xerxes left behind a massive army under the command of his brother-in-law, Mardonius, one of the most capable generals in the Persian Empire. Mardonius was no mere figurehead. He had campaigned in Thrace and Macedonia, understood Greek politics and warfare, and commanded a force that ancient sources numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians estimate it was more likely between 70,000 and 120,000 men. Even at the lower estimate, this was the largest army ever assembled in mainland Greece. The Greeks, meanwhile, struggled with their perennial problem: unity. The Greek city-states were fiercely independent, prone to jealousy, competition, and outright conflict with one another. Only the existential threat of Persian conquest had forced them into an alliance, and even that alliance was fragile. Sparta, the preeminent military power, was reluctant to march north of the Isthmus of Corinth, preferring to fortify the narrow neck of land and defend the Peloponnese. Athens, having been evacuated and burned, desperately needed allies to help reclaim their city and territory. It took months of negotiation, threats, and political maneuvering before the Greeks finally assembled a united army. In the summer of 479 BCE, they marched north under Spartan command, led by the regent Pausanias, who ruled on behalf of the young king Pleistarchos. The Greeks fielded perhaps 40,000 hoplites, the heavily armed infantry that was the backbone of Greek warfare, plus tens of thousands of light-armed troops. It was an unprecedented show of unity. The two armies met in the region of Boeotia, near the small city of Plataea, which had been a loyal Greek ally despite being surrounded by pro-Persian Theban territory. For days, they faced each other across the Asopus River, neither willing to make the first decisive move. The Persians held the north bank, with their vast encampment stretching for miles. The Greeks occupied the lower slopes of the Cithaeron Mountains to the south, with access to freshwater springs and good defensive terrain. The art of ancient warfare. Before we can understand the catastrophic engagement that destroyed the Persian force, we need to grasp the fundamental differences between Greek and Persian military systems. These were not merely different armies. They represented entirely different philosophies of warfare, social organization, and political power. The Greek hoplite was a citizen soldier, typically a property owner who could afford his own equipment. His panoply, the complete set of armor and weapons, was expensive and represented a significant investment. It included a bronze helmet, often of the Corinthian style that covered most of the face, a bronze breastplate or a layered linen cuirass, bronze greaves protecting the shins, and a large round shield called an aspis or hoplon, roughly 3 feet in diameter and made of wood covered with bronze. The hoplite's primary weapon was the dory, a spear approximately 7 to 9 feet long with an iron head for thrusting and a bronze butt spike that could be driven into the ground or used as a secondary weapon if the spear shaft broke. As a backup weapon, he carried a short sword called a xiphos, with a leaf-shaped blade designed primarily for stabbing in close combat. But the real power of the hoplite lay not in his individual prowess, but in the phalanx formation. Greek hoplites fought shoulder to shoulder in ranks, typically 8 men deep, each man's shield protecting not only himself, but also the man to his left. This created an overlapping wall of bronze and wood, a formation that was nearly impenetrable from the front when properly maintained. The front ranks extended their spears forward, creating a hedge of iron points that made frontal assault suicidal. The rear ranks provided weight, pushing the formation forward, replacing casualties, and preventing the line from being pushed back. The phalanx was a brutal, grinding form of warfare. When 2 phalanxes met, the result was called othismos, the push. Men in the front ranks stabbed over and around shields, trying to find gaps in armor, while the rear ranks pushed forward with their shields against the backs of the men in front. It was claustrophobic, exhausting, and terrifying. Men died from heat exhaustion inside their armor, from spear thrusts to the throat or groin, from being trampled after falling, or from being pushed backward so that they lost their footing and were finished on the ground. But for all its fearsome reputation, the phalanx had significant weaknesses. It required level ground to maintain formation. It was vulnerable on the flanks and rear, where men could not bring their shields to bear effectively. It was slow and inflexible, unable to wheel or maneuver quickly without risking dissolution of the formation. And it required intense discipline and training to maintain cohesion under pressure. The Spartans had taken the phalanx to its ultimate expression. From age 7, Spartan boys entered the agog, a brutal state education system that transformed them into professional soldiers. They lived in barracks, trained constantly, and learned to fight as a unit with perfect coordination. Spartan discipline was legendary. They could form, reform, wheel, and maneuver their phalanx with a precision no other Greek city could match. They fought to the music of flutes, which helped them keep step and maintain formation. In battle, they wore distinctive red cloaks and carried shields marked with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, their state's ancient name. The Persian army was organized on entirely different principles. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching from Egypt to India, and its army reflected this diversity. Persian forces included contingents from dozens of subject peoples, each fighting in their traditional style with their traditional weapons. There were Indians with cotton armor and cane bows, Ethiopians with zebra hide shields, Thracians with fox-skin caps, and countless others. The core of the Persian army consisted of cavalry and archers. Persian nobles were horsemen, trained from childhood in riding and archery. The famous Parthian shot, firing arrows while riding away from the enemy, was a Persian specialty long before the Parthians existed as a distinct people. Persian cavalry could harass enemy formations, probe for weaknesses, and exploit gaps with devastating charges. Persian infantry were primarily archers, carrying large wicker shields called speras that could be planted in the ground to create a defensive wall. Behind these shields, archers could rain arrows on enemy formations. The Persian bow was a composite recurve design, extremely powerful and with longer range than the simple bows used by most Greeks. A Persian archer could shoot accurately at 150 yards and could reach targets at 250 yards or more. The elite troops of the Persian army were the immortals, so called because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. Whenever one fell, he was immediately replaced. These were professional soldiers, the best of the Persian and Median nobility, equipped with spears, swords, wicker shields, and scale armor. They wore distinctive pleated robes and carried their equipment in elaborate style befitting the elite guard of the great king. The Persian system was effective against most opponents. Their cavalry could ride down lighter infantry, their archers could break up enemy formations from a distance, and their diverse troops could adapt to various terrains and situations. But against the Greek phalanx, Persian tactics faced serious problems. Arrows, while deadly in the open, were much less effective against heavily armored hoplites, especially at close range. Cavalry struggled to break a properly formed phalanx. Horses would not charge into a wall of spears, and individual horsemen could be dragged down by determined infantry. The Persian infantry, lightly armed compared to hoplites, stood little chance in direct hand-to-hand combat. The Persians had learned this painful lesson at Marathon, 10 years before Plataea. There, a smaller Greek force had endured the arrow storm, closed with the Persian infantry, and routed them through superior close combat capability. The Persians lost that battle, but gained valuable intelligence about Greek warfare. Mardonius understood the Greek system and had developed a strategy to counter it: the strategic stalemate. For 11 days, the two armies faced each other across the Asopus River, neither willing to make the decisive move. This was not cowardice, but calculated strategy on both sides. The terrain favored the Greeks. The lower slopes of Cithaeron provided high ground and good defensive positions. The Greeks had access to reliable water sources, particularly the Gargaphia spring, and their supply lines ran back through the mountains to friendly territory in the Peloponnese. Mardonius faced a more complex situation. He needed to force a battle on favorable terms, but attacking the Greek position would mean crossing the river under fire and then assaulting uphill against entrenched hoplites. This was a recipe for disaster. Instead, he tried to draw the Greeks down onto the plain, where his cavalry could be most effective and where there was room to maneuver and potentially envelop the Greek flanks. The Persians had some advantages. They were in friendly territory. Thebes and most of Boeotia had sided with Persia, providing supplies and local knowledge. The Persian cavalry was the finest in the world, and the flat plains north of the Asopus were perfect cavalry terrain. Mardonius also had time on his side, or so he thought. The Greek alliance was fragile. If he could delay long enough, the Greeks might lose patience, argue among themselves, and dissolve back to their individual cities. The Greeks, for their part, were in no hurry to descend to the plain. Pausanias, the Spartan regent commanding the Greek forces, was young but not foolish. He understood that his advantages lay in the defensive position and in the superior close combat capability of his hoplites. His challenge was maintaining Greek unity and morale while avoiding being drawn into battle on Persian terms. For days, the armies probed and maneuvered. Small engagements flared along the river. Persian cavalry would advance to harass Greek foragers or units that ventured too far from the main position. Greek light troops would respond, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The most famous of these skirmishes involved the Athenian Mecistius, commander of the Persian cavalry, who was killed in a fierce fight with Athenian infantry. His death was a blow to Persian morale and a boost to Greek confidence. But Mardonius was not idle. He began implementing a strategy of attrition designed to undermine the Greek position without risking a direct assault. Persian cavalry ranged widely, attacking Greek supply columns as they came through the mountain passes from the south. This was extremely effective. The Greek army required enormous quantities of food, water, and other supplies daily. Disrupting these supplies would eventually force the Greeks either to retreat or to come down onto the plain to fight. The decisive moment came when Persian cavalry discovered and managed to choke off the Gargaphia spring, the primary water source for the Greek position. Ancient accounts describe the Persians fouling the spring or blocking it, forcing the Greeks to rely on more distant water sources or to descend to the river itself. This was a crisis. An army of tens of thousands cannot survive without adequate water, especially in the summer heat while wearing bronze armor. The fatal retreat. Pausanias called a council of war. The Greek position had become untenable. Without reliable access to water, and with their supply lines under constant attack, they could not maintain their current location. After intense debate, the Greeks decided to retreat under cover of darkness to a new position nearer to Plataea itself, where they would have better access to water and where the terrain would still favor them. This decision, while strategically sound, was tactically perilous. Moving tens of thousands of men in darkness across several miles of unfamiliar terrain was inherently risky. The phalanx required organization and cohesion. A night march threatened to scatter the army into disordered groups. If the Persians discovered the retreat and attacked during the movement, the results could be catastrophic. The Greeks began their withdrawal in the night. The plan called for a staged movement, with different contingents moving at different times to maintain some coherent defensive capability. But, almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Some units moved too quickly, others too slowly. In the darkness, contingents lost contact with each other. The different Greek cities, each used to operating independently, struggled to coordinate their movements. Some accounts suggest that certain commanders, particularly from cities that had been reluctant to join the campaign, saw this as an opportunity to retreat all the way back to the relative safety of the Isthmus of Corinth. Whether from genuine confusion, poor coordination, or deliberate self-interest, parts of the Greek army ended up considerably farther back than planned, in some cases nearly reaching Plataea itself, several miles from the original position. As dawn broke, the situation became clear, and it was dire. The Greek army was scattered across the landscape in at least 3 separate groups. The center and left wing, including the Athenians and many of the smaller contingents, had retreated to positions near Plataea. But the right wing, the Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies from Tegea, were dangerously isolated. They had delayed their retreat, possibly to serve as a rear guard, possibly due to the obstinacy of a subordinate commander who refused to retreat at all. Ancient sources blame a Spartan officer named Amampharitus, who declared that Spartans did not retreat from barbarians. Whatever the reason, when dawn came, approximately 2,500 Spartan and Tegean hoplites found themselves alone on the plain, separated from the main Greek force by a mile or more of open ground. Behind them, the Cithaeron mountains offered no refuge. They would have to cross the plain under Persian observation to reach safety. Before them, across the Asopus River, the entire Persian army was beginning to stir. Mardonius, surveying the situation from his camp, could hardly believe his fortune. The Greeks, whose tight formations and defensive positions had stymied him for days, had apparently dissolved in a panicked night retreat. Better still, a substantial contingent of Spartans, the cream of the Greek army, was isolated and vulnerable. Here was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He immediately ordered an attack. The storm descends. The Persian cavalry struck first, as cavalry always did. Thousands of horsemen poured across the river and onto the plain, surrounding the isolated Spartans on three sides. They rode in close, firing arrows into the compact mass of hoplites, then wheeling away before the Greeks could respond. This was the tactic that had broken so many enemies of Persia: harass with missiles, avoid direct combat, wear down the enemy until they broke and ran, then ride them down as they fled. The Spartans did what they were trained to do. They formed their phalanx, shields overlapping, the famous lambda emblazoned in red glowing in the morning sun. They locked their shields and crouched behind them, presenting the smallest target possible. Arrows clattered off bronze and embedded themselves in the wooden shields. Some found gaps. A man would cry out, stagger, and fall, and the ranks would close immediately, maintaining the formation. The Spartans did not respond, did not break formation, did not give the cavalry the opening they were probing for. But this could not last indefinitely. The Spartans were taking casualties, and more importantly, the Persian infantry was now crossing the river in force. Mardonius led them personally, at the head of the Immortals and the best Persian troops. Ancient sources number this force at 50,000 men, though this may be an exaggeration. What is certain is that they vastly outnumbered the isolated Greeks, perhaps by a factor of 20 to 1 or more. The Persians advanced in their traditional formation. The front ranks planted their wicker shields in the ground, creating a wall. Behind this wall, ranks of archers began firing at close range, a storm of arrows that darkened the sky. This was the moment of maximum danger for the Greeks. They could not advance while under such intense missile fire, but they also could not stand indefinitely as men were picked off one by one. Pausanias, commanding the Spartans, faced an impossible situation. Advancing against overwhelming numbers seemed suicidal. Retreating would mean exposing their backs to cavalry and arrows, certain annihilation. Staying in place meant slow attrition. He needed help, and he needed it soon. He sent desperate messages to the other Greek contingents, particularly to the Athenians, who were closest. But the Athenians were engaged with Persian forces of their own, and the terrain made rapid movement difficult. The Spartans were alone. Pausanias made a decision that seems strange to us but was standard practice in Greek warfare. He ordered his men to hold position and began making sacrifices to the gods, seeking favorable omens. Ancient Greek generals did not move without divine approval, indicated by the sacrifices. Pausanias sacrificed animal after animal, reading the entrails, looking for a sign that the gods approved of an advance. Meanwhile, his men continued to fall. The Tegeans, standing beside the Spartans, had no such reservations. Seeing their Spartan allies pinned down and the Persian infantry advancing, they charged. Approximately 500 Tegean hoplites lowered their spears and ran at the Persian line. This was both brave and desperate. Charging unsupported against vastly superior numbers violated every principle of Greek warfare, which emphasized the cohesion of the phalanx above individual heroism. But the Tegeans saw no alternative. Their charge had an immediate effect. The Persian archers, confronted with heavily armored infantry running at them at full speed, ceased firing and braced for impact. The Persians were skilled warriors, but they were lightly equipped compared to hoplites. When the Tegeans crashed into their line, the momentum of the charge and the weight of their armor drove deep into the Persian formation. The wicker shields, effective against arrows, shattered under the impact of bronze-clad warriors wielding iron-tipped spears. This was the moment Pausanias had been waiting for. Whether his sacrifices had finally shown favorable signs, or whether he simply saw the opportunity created by the Tegean charge, he ordered the Spartans forward. 2,500 men began to move. Slowly at first, maintaining their tight formation, then accelerating into a trot, and finally into a full run. The discipline that separated Spartans from all other Greeks showed itself here. Even at a full charge, their formation remained coherent, their shield wall unbroken. The clash of empires. The impact when the Spartans hit the Persian line was devastating. The Persian infantry fought bravely. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who chronicled these events, goes out of his way to praise their courage. They grabbed Greek spears with their bare hands, trying to break them or wrench them away. They fought with swords and daggers at close quarters. The immortals, Persia's elite troops, died in heaps rather than retreat. But courage was not enough. The fundamental problem of equipment and training proved decisive. A Persian soldier wore, at best, a cloth or leather tunic and perhaps some scale armor. His shield was wicker, designed to stop arrows, not to withstand the thrust of an iron-tipped spear backed by the weight and training of a Spartan warrior. His weapons, a short spear, a sword, or a dagger, could not reach through the long spears of the first three ranks of the phalanx. In the brutal physics of close combat, mass and momentum matter. A hoplite in full armor weighed perhaps 175 pounds of flesh and bone, plus another 70 pounds of bronze and iron. When 2,500 such men hit a line of more lightly armed infantry at a run, the result was like a bronze wave crashing over a beach. The Persian line buckled, bent, and then broke. The Persian cavalry, which had been so effective at harassing the Greeks from a distance, found itself ineffective at close quarters. The close-packed melee of infantry provided no clear targets for horsemen, and the risk of being pulled from their saddles or having their horses killed made them hesitant to press too close. They continued to harry the flanks, but they could not stop the Greek advance. Mardonius himself was in the thick of the fighting, mounted on a white horse and surrounded by his personal guard of 1,000 picked Persian warriors. He fought with the fury of a man who understood that his personal honor and the fate of Persian power in Greece were being decided in these moments. But valor and desperation could not overcome the grinding efficiency of the Spartan phalanx. A Spartan warrior named Amnestus hurled a rock, the primitive but effective missile weapon that hoplites often employed when their spears broke, and struck Mardonius in the head. The Persian commander fell from his horse, dead or dying. The death of Mardonius was the beginning of the end for the Persian force. In ancient warfare, where communication was limited and command depended on visibility of leaders, the death of a commander often led to immediate dissolution of the army. The Persians had no clear chain of succession, no secondary commander of Mardonius's stature who could take control. The immortals and the best Persian troops fought on, surrounding their fallen commander's body, refusing to yield. But the rest of the Persian line began to crumble. What had been an orderly battle line became a chaotic retreat. Persian soldiers threw down their shields and ran for their fortified camp across the river. The Greeks pursued, now in the element where they were least effective, a scattered pursuit where individual combat replaced the cohesion of the phalanx. But the damage was done. The Persian infantry that had engaged the Spartans had been shattered, and with Mardonius dead, there was no one to organize a counterattack or orderly withdrawal. The wider battle. While the Spartans and Tegeans were destroying the Persian center, the rest of the battle was unfolding across a front of several miles. The Athenians, who had been ordered to support the Spartans, found their path blocked by Greek cities that had sided with Persia, particularly Thebes. A bitter fight broke out between Greeks on opposite sides, with the Athenians ultimately prevailing but unable to reach the Spartans in time to participate in the main engagement. The other Greek contingents, scattered by the confused night retreat, began converging on the Persian camp. What happened next was less a battle than a siege. The Persians had constructed a wooden palisade around their camp, and behind these walls, the remnants of their army made a stand. Without Mardonius to lead them, and with their best troops dead on the field, the Persians were leaderless and demoralized, but they were still numerous and fighting for their lives. The Greeks, particularly the Spartans, were not experienced in siege warfare. Their entire military culture revolved around the phalanx and open battle. Attacking fortifications was foreign to them. The Athenians, with their longer experience of varied warfare and their siege of various cities, took the lead. They found ways to undermine and assault the palisade, and eventually the Greek forces broke into the camp. What followed was a massacre. The Greeks showed little mercy, and the Persians, trapped within their own fortifications with no escape route, died by the thousands. Ancient sources claim that only 3,000 Persians escaped from the camp out of the tens of thousands who had retreated there. This is likely an exaggeration, but the casualty figures were certainly catastrophic. Herodotus claims that the Spartans lost only 91 men in the entire battle, while the Persians lost tens of thousands. Why the Greeks won: the victory of the isolated 2,500 Greeks over vastly superior Persian. Numbers was not a miracle, nor was it simply a matter of Greek superiority. It resulted from a confluence of factors, some tactical, some strategic, and some cultural. First, the equipment and training of the Greek hoplite, particularly the Spartan hoplite, was specifically designed for the kind of close-quarters combat that developed. The heavy armor, large shield, and long spear gave the Greeks overwhelming advantages in hand-to-hand fighting. The Persian infantry, optimized for mobility and missile warfare, could not compete on these terms. Second, the discipline and cohesion of the Spartan phalanx proved decisive. Lesser Greek armies might have broken under the arrow storm or dissolved into individual combat where their numerical disadvantage would have told. The Spartans maintained their formation under intense pressure, turned an ordered charge into a devastating strike, and fought with a cohesion that multiplied their effective strength many times over. Third, the Persians made critical errors. Mardonius allowed his desire for a decisive victory to override his tactical judgment. He should have been content to harass the isolated Spartans with cavalry and arrows until they were forced to retreat, or until hunger and thirst broke them. Instead, he committed his infantry to close combat where Greek advantages were greatest. His personal leadership from the front, while brave, proved fatal. Ancient armies could not easily survive the death of their commander. Fourth, the terrain and circumstances favored the Greeks despite appearances. The relatively level ground allowed the Spartans to maintain formation. The isolation of the Greek force, while dangerous, also meant there was no confusion about where to go or what to do. They had to fight or die. This clarity of purpose, this existential simplicity, can be a powerful force in battle. Finally, there is the matter of motivation and morale. The Persians were fighting far from home for the glory of an emperor who had already returned to Asia, led by nobles whose personal ambitions were as important as the campaign's success. The Greeks were fighting for survival, for their homes, for their families, and for a concept of freedom that was central to their identity. They could not retreat. Behind them lay everything they valued. This was not their only advantage, but it was not negligible. Aftermath and legacy. The Battle of Plataea did not end with the destruction of the Persian force that engaged the Spartans. The fighting continued as the Greeks assaulted the camp and hunted down retreating Persians. The Theban contingent, which had fought for Persia, was defeated by the Athenians, and suffered heavy casualties. The Greek cities that had collaborated with Persia faced retribution. But the decisive moment was the death of Mardonius and the destruction of his best troops by the Spartans and Tegeans. Without this victory, the Persians might have regrouped, consolidated their forces, and continued the campaign. With Mardonius dead and the army broken, the Persian presence in Greece collapsed. The remnants of the Persian army retreated through Thessaly and Thrace, harassed all the way until they crossed back into Asia. Persia would never again threaten the Greek mainland. The victory at Plataea, combined with the near-simultaneous Greek naval victory at Mycale off the coast of Asia Minor, marked the definitive end of the Persian invasion. Greece was saved, and the Greeks immediately went on the offensive, liberating Greek cities in Asia Minor and beginning a decades-long campaign that would eventually culminate in Alexander the Great's conquest of the entire Persian Empire 150 years later. The battle itself entered Greek consciousness as one of the defining moments of Hellenic history. Along with Marathon and Thermopylae, Plataea became synonymous with Greek courage and freedom's triumph over tyranny. The Spartans, already respected as Greece's premier warriors, cemented their reputation as invincible in pitched battle. No one would seriously challenge Spartan supremacy in land warfare for another 70 years. The courage of the isolated 2,500 became legend. These were men who faced impossible odds without flinching, who maintained their discipline under fire, who charged when retreat would have been understandable, and who won when defeat seemed certain. They embodied the Spartan ideal of standing firm, of never retreating, of victory or death. The Persian Empire, for its part, learned a bitter lesson about the limits of numerical superiority. The Persians were not cowards or poor warriors. Herodotus is explicit about their bravery. But they had encountered a military system specifically designed to counter their advantages and exploit their weaknesses. The phalanx, for all its limitations, was nearly unbeatable in direct frontal combat when properly deployed. Persian tactics of mobility and missile fire worked against most enemies, but against the unique combination of Greek equipment, training, and social organization, they were insufficient. The human element beyond strategy and tactics, beyond equipment and formations. The story of the 2,500 Greeks at Plataea is fundamentally a human story. These were men who woke that morning expecting to complete a retreat to safety and instead found themselves isolated and facing annihilation. They were afraid. Herodotus preserves stories of their fear, of Pausanias's desperate sacrifices seeking divine approval, of the terrible tension as arrows fell and men died while they waited for the order to charge. Yet they did not break. They held their formation. They trusted in their training, their equipment, their commanders, and each other. When the order came, they charged into overwhelming numbers with the certainty that they would either win or die. There was no middle ground, no possibility of surrender or retreat. The Persians would not have spared them. Persian policy towards defeated enemies was harsh, involving enslavement at best and execution at worst. This clarity of stakes, win or die, concentrates the mind wonderfully. The Spartans fought with the fury of men with no other options, but they also fought with the precision of warriors who had trained their entire lives for this moment. The famous Spartan discipline was not mere parade ground formation, but a hard-won ability to maintain cohesion and effectiveness under the most extreme stress imaginable. On the Persian side, we see the tragedy of brave men let down by their equipment and their command structure. The immortals who died defending Mardonius's body, the common soldiers who grabbed Greek spears with bare hands, the cavalry who charged repeatedly into danger. These were courageous warriors. But courage alone, without the right tools and tactics, is not enough. The Persians learned what countless armies throughout history have learned: that motivation and numbers cannot always overcome technological, tactical, and training advantages. The death of Mardonius itself is emblematic. Here was one of Persia's greatest generals, brother-in-law to the great king, a man of proven ability and courage. He led from the front, exposing himself to danger to inspire his troops. And he died from a rock to the head, the most primitive of weapons, thrown by a single Spartan warrior. All his rank, his experience, his elaborate armor and fine horse could not save him from one well-thrown stone in the chaos of battle. Conclusion. The story of how 2,500 Greeks destroyed a Persian force more than 20 times their size is not a simple tale of heroism overcoming odds, though heroism certainly played its part. It is a complex narrative of military systems in collision, of strategic circumstances creating tactical opportunities, of training and equipment proving decisive, and of human courage and discipline turning a desperate situation into an improbable victory. The Greeks won because they had developed a military system, the hoplite phalanx, that was nearly unbeatable in its specific domain of close-quarters frontal combat. They won because the Spartans had taken this system to its highest expression through their rigorous training and unmatched discipline. They won because the Persians made mistakes, committing their infantry to battle on unfavorable terms and losing their commander at a critical moment. But they also won because, when morning came and they found themselves isolated and facing death, they did not panic. They formed their lines, endured the arrow storm, and when the moment came, charged with absolute determination into the heart of the enemy. They fought not just for victory, but for survival, not just for themselves, but for everything they valued. And in the end, this combination of system, training, circumstances, and human will proved unstoppable. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. It reinforced Greek belief in their own superiority, in the value of freedom and citizenship over the despotism of Oriental empires. This cultural confidence would fuel Greek achievements in philosophy, art, science, and literature for centuries to come. The clash at Plataea was not just a military engagement, but a collision of civilizations. And in that moment, on a dusty plain in Boeotia, the West won a victory whose consequences echo through history. The last 2,500 Greeks at Plataea did not merely survive against overwhelming odds. They shattered Persian power in Europe, secured Greek independence, and demonstrated that a small force of disciplined, well-equipped, and motivated warriors could overcome seemingly insurmountable numerical superiority. Their victory stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of how tactical excellence, social organization, and human courage can triumph over sheer weight of numbers. On that morning in 479 BCE, when the Spartans and Tegeans charged into the Persian host, they changed the course of Western civilization forever.